When I was young, why goodness me, I used to dream all day of elephants and crocodiles in places far away. But of all things weird and wonderful, it's very strange but true. Although I love my teddy bear, I like monsters too.
My first experience with vampires. It's difficult to describe your reaction the first time you meet a vampire. Many things go through your mind at once. On the one hand, you can try and rationalise it any way you can. On the other, however, there is a twisted fascination because it challenges everything you thought you knew. If vampires exist, what else is real? You now know that life after death is possible, that creatures who defy the natural order exist, and that mankind does not rule the world in the way we would like to believe. Above all else, however, is the terror of not just facing such an unforgiving, relentless monster, but knowing that thousands of others like it are out there, hiding in the dark. My name is Ferne Shelley, and this is how I came to learn the truth about vampires. My first encounter with the undead occurred in the quaint little town of Lista. I had just finished my psychology degree at the University of Essex. I must confess that I had largely become a student in the first place simply because I wanted to put off going to work a couple of years. In many ways, this trip was supposed to be just another way of postponing my inevitable move from being a carefree, happy-go-lucky student to the trenches of a 9-to-5 desk job. I had 3 real friends throughout my time at university: Marie, Claire, and Diana. They were really the first friends I ever had. I was always something of a loner as a child, and I was picked on a lot through my childhood and my teenage years. I remember being so happy in my last year at school simply because everyone just forgot who I was, which sadly was a step up to how I had been treated before. My relationship with my parents had always been somewhat cold too. They were never cruel, but at the same time they never really paid much attention to me either. I remember wanting to confide in them about what was happening at school, but they just weren't interested in any meaningful way. They always struck me as the type of people who didn't really want to give up the rich social life they had before I was born. Even when I was a young girl, I can remember them leaving me with the babysitters and relatives to go on holidays, and even just nights out. When I went to uni, it was like being transported to an entirely different universe. Well, at least that's what it felt like at the time. When I did visit another university years later, it was somewhat of a different experience. I'd been mistreated for so long that someone being polite was an alien experience to me. All I really wanted was to matter to someone. I finally did find someone who loved me for who I was, not long into my first year at uni. Claire Jane. She was a lot more confident than me. She had a boyfriend named Michael who had been her high school sweetheart, but I still got the impression that she was desperate to meet new people as well. It was easier for her than me. She was such a friendly, nice, chatty person, and it was through her that I would meet Marie and Diana. All 4 of us were in the same class, and having already loosely known Claire, she asked me along with Marie and Diana to go for a drink one time. The 4 of us ended up becoming fast friends, and my time with them over the next 3 years would go on to be the happiest of my entire life. No one made me feel as sure and as confident of myself as Claire did. Really, she was the cool older sister I never had. Even though she was 2 years younger than me, she always just seemed more mature. I thought we would always be friends, with the both of us going down the pub as old ladies. But sadly, life would take us down very different paths. It all began on our trip through Europe in the year 1979, 12 years ago, which started badly, when we soon became lost in the German countryside. Sadly, whilst Claire was a wonderful woman in many ways, she didn't have the best sense of direction. To be fair, we were all to blame, however. We didn't really have any proper plan. We had just hoped to travel through the German countryside, visiting small towns along the way, having fun at German festivals, getting drunk, and maybe meeting some cute German guys. When we finally reached the town of Lista, it was such a relief. Though if I had known what was about to happen to the town, I would have turned and run as fast as I could in the opposite direction. Lista was a beautiful place, with a real innocence among its townfolk, which may have been why the vampires had enjoyed targeting it for so long. The pack of vampires that had terrorised the town were led by a particularly vicious member of their kind, named Carlos, who had been turned sometime in the 15th century. He was a survivor, having lived through the rule of the Vandals, demonic rivals of vampires who ruled Europe for many centuries, and both world wars. Unlike most other members of his kind, he did not join the side of the Nazis during the conflict. Not for any moral reasons, of course. Being a born survivor, he wisely kept himself out of both world wars and simply continued to prey on small rural areas. Lista had been his latest target. For months, his vampires had been visiting the town every night, dragging people away. Men, women, children, even infants. Their victims' remains would usually be found strung up in trees near the town for their families to find the next day. The people at first were too scared to do anything against the monsters. Some of the villagers even thought they could appease the vampires. But when it became obvious that the demons couldn't be bargained with, the people finally fought back. The vampires, having believed that the townsfolk had been terrorised to the point that they were docile, were completely caught off guard when the people of Lista pelted the beasts with bottles of holy water. Overwhelmed, the vampires were driven by the villagers to the massive pit the villagers had dug during the day, filled with stakes. The vampires that fell into it were either impaled or burned to death by being doused with holy water. Carlos, however, was wise enough to flee as soon as he saw the holy water. Vampires are notorious cowards. While most of his men were killed by the villagers. Unfortunately, however, Carlos just became eager to get the villagers back for this humiliation. It wasn't just petty revenge. Having built a reputation as a supposed king of the vampires in the local area, Carlos could not allow this humiliation to go unpunished. The villagers, meanwhile, foolishly believed that they had seen the last of the vampires and celebrated afterwards. When we arrived, it had been 2 weeks since the vampires had been defeated, and the town was still celebrating. We saw a mass of people gathered round an effigy of Dracula being burned, and there was also a festival in the streets, with people wearing Dracula masks, and even children holding up crude drawings of vampires with stakes through their hearts. I remember thinking it was odd, but I assumed it was just an obscure festival like Day of the Dead. It seemed quite charming in a way, and we even took part in some of the festivities before finding a hotel for the night. A warm, cosy bed, a nice little town with an eccentric, quirky festival I could tell people about back home. I honestly thought this holiday was beginning to pick up. I have tragically never been more wrong about anything in my entire life. Karos had slowly been building up his forces in the fortnight since his humiliating defeat. Snatching hitchhikers, stopping cars going down the road and pulling their unfortunate occupants out and turning them into vampires. He also recruited numerous vampire clans from the local area who again feared him and knew of his reputation as the king and called in favours with the other vampires all over Europe to help bring about his revenge. However, what really gave Karos the edge was the fact that he was able to take control of the town's only priest, a man named George. Karos's breed of vampire, who were known as the Nosferatu, had the power to take control of any human being they bit. Even the strongest wills couldn't resist the power of a Nosferatu. And Karos had bitten the priest on the night his forces were repelled. The poor souls that the Nosferatus take control over are still awake. They are just unable to go against the vampire's commands. The priest wanted to warn the town that the vampires were planning another attack with all his heart and soul, but he just couldn't. Under the Vampire King's command, he would perform a black mass ritual to deconcentrate all of the holy water, a ritual which involved him butchering a woman the vampires had captured. He obviously would not bless any more water either. Karos and his now larger group of vampires decided to strike the people of Lista during the night, just after the party. It was an absolute slaughter. The vampires butchered the people still in the streets and burned down houses in order to drive people out, as the vampires could not enter a house without an invitation. Without the holy water to burn the vampires from a distance, there was no way anyone in the village could fight back. I remember waking up to the sound of screaming in the streets. At first, I assumed it was just people getting a little too rowdy during the festival, but then, all of a sudden, something came crashing through the window. Panicked, I instantly rose from my bed, still somewhat dazed and half asleep. I could see through the smoke which soon filled the air that there was a fire at the end of the room. I realised what had happened, as insane as it may have sounded. Someone from the streets had thrown a petrol bomb in through the window. I turned to wake Claire, who was lying next to me. We had been lucky enough to get 2 rooms, one for me and Claire, and another for Marie and Diana. Claire began screaming at the sight of the fire, but thankfully she didn't let her fear overwhelm her and jumped out of bed while making sure that I was right behind her. We both headed for the door which the fire hadn't reached yet. Out of the hall, everyone had fled their rooms, including Marie and Diana, as they had all been petrol bombed. All of the guests and staff hurried down the steps in a stampede through the hall, down the steps and out onto the streets. Outside looked like a war zone. Buildings on fire, people running through the streets in sheer panic. Straight across the other end of the road, I could see a figure standing over a woman, seemingly biting her neck. The woman was clearly dead. Her throat had been torn clean out. Blood was dripping down the pavement and onto the street. The figure standing over her then looked up at us, all huddled together, utterly petrified. The figure's skin was completely snow white. Its eyes, meanwhile, were just as red as the blood dripping from its mouth. It had no hair, and every tooth in its head was razor sharp, though its upper canines were far longer than the rest of its teeth. The monster's clothes were ratty and torn, and a slime dripped from its fingers. I could hear a squelching sound as it walked, barefooted and slowly towards us. It actually left a slime trail behind it, just like a slug. The smell that came from the creature was overwhelming. It practically choked me. Honestly, I wanted to be sick just looking at it. We all began to back away slowly from the monster, when all of a sudden, one of the women at the back screamed. I turned and to my horror saw 4 similar creatures crawling down the walls of the flaming hotel like spiders. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. But before I could take it in, the monster suddenly jumped through the air and landed on several people in the crowd, including the poor woman who'd screamed. The beasts ripped at their throats in seconds with their bare teeth. We all ran. Marie, Diana, and Claire kept close to me. As we fled through the town, we saw people being cornered, beaten, torn apart by the monsters. There was nothing any of us could do to help them. We could hear the creatures roaring and hissing behind us, but none of us looked back. I was just so terrified. I had no thought other than to get the hell out of this place. That began to look like an impossibility, however. At the end of the road, we could see 5 of the creatures completely covered in blood and entrails blocking the way forward. We all stopped and froze. There was seemingly no way of escape. As I turned around, I could see more of those hideous things coming up the other direction. I still couldn't even believe the situation I was in. I almost felt like laughing at the absurdity of it all, when suddenly the monsters began to wince and cower. I turned round to see a young man standing in the road, wielding a cross. He'd come out of one of the houses. He was reasonably young, probably closer to my age, had thick black hair, was quite tall and athletic looking. He told us to follow him, and we all instantly agreed. The fact that he didn't have fangs, red eyes, or stunk definitely worked in his favour. He ran through the house he'd just come through on the left side of the street. Though it was burning, he still went through as the flames hadn't consumed the whole house. Marie was a little hesitant to follow, however, which would prove to be a fatal mistake. She was scared of the flames, but as Claire reached out to try and help her, one of the brutes snatched Marie from behind and pulled her backwards. Another 2 then jumped her, and they all began tearing her apart. The man who helped us said that there was nothing that we could do for her, and sadly, he was right. And that still didn't stop us from having to pull Claire back. After we made our way through the house, we reached the garden. On just the outside of the garden, there were the remains of a family, clearly the occupants of the house who had tried to escape the fire and been pounced on by the vampires waiting outside. We continued to run down the street, passing more burning houses, with the man who saved us waving across in the direction of any vampires that came near. Eventually we reached our destination, the bomb shelter in the garden of another burning house. There was a second man in the shelter. He was much smaller, somewhat out of shape, with grey hair, and clearly a lot older. He didn't look pleased to see us at all. In fact, he started to scream at the younger man.
"Brian, what on earth are you playing at, rushing out there, when the town is being torn apart by those monsters? Always desperate to play the hero, aren't you? For all you know, these women have been bitten and are under their control."
Brian tried to assure the older man, who was called Alan, and was Brian's father, that he was sure we weren't vampire stooges. Of course, I couldn't understand a word they were saying, but fortunately Claire, who could speak German, was translating for me and Diana. Brian and his father kept arguing after we were let in the shelter. Eventually, Claire suddenly interrupted them and asked, "Excuse me, what do you mean, under their control?" Brian spoke softly to Claire and said,
"Those monsters, vampires, have the power to put anyone they bite under their control."
He began to tear up and couldn't look at Claire anymore.
"One of them bit my mother. They snatched her just outside our garden. Dad tried to help her, but he had been cornered by the flames. They'd already petrol-bombed our house. I was lucky to get out of my room alive. I could see what they did to my mother. From my bedroom window, however, they forced her to murder my sister."
Claire was in shock. I could see Alan at the other end of the room weeping uncontrollably, his head in his hands. Brian continued.
"When they bit her, they threw her and Sarah together. Mum and Sarah, they hugged for a while. She even told Sarah that it would all be okay. And then, suddenly, she threw Sarah to the floor. The vampires then handed Mum a hammer and she...
He didn't finish, but he didn't have to. Once he had regained his composure, he explained that the bomb shelter was built during the Second World War and that even the vampires couldn't get through it. Brian said that it was best to wait here until some help had arrived. That could be months, however, I thought, assuming it ever did arrive. Sadly, this was our only option. The streets of Lista were a literal war zone. None of us dared to brave them again. The night was long and difficult. All 5 of us hardly spoke a word, though all of us took it in turns to cry. We had all lost so much that night. I tried to remain calm and brave, but at times it hit me that I would never see Marie ever again. Then it would hit me that it was because of vampires. What was I going to tell her parents? It would all get too much for me and I'd break down. I didn't sleep at all that night. When dawn broke, Alan and Brian told us that we needed to go now as the vampires could not come out during the day. Brian, ever desperate to play the hero, went out first just to see that there were no vampires. Brian and Alan's house had been burned down. The streets were littered with bodies and pieces of bodies. Blood literally caked the pavements, and most of the houses were in ruins. The stench of death was everywhere. As we walked nervously down the street, Claire suddenly tackled me to the floor. I looked up to see a car driving at an incredible speed down the road before it smashed into a house at the other end. Claire saved my life, whilst Alan, Diana and Brian had managed to jump to the other side. The car had come so quickly from around the corner I didn't even notice it. As I looked around, I noticed a large group of people at either end of the street. The people were covered in cuts and bruises. Clearly, the vampires had been torturing them all night, but the bloodsuckers hadn't killed them, as they wanted these people to be their eyes and ears during the daytime. We all instantly headed back to the shelter, with the vampires' human servants in hot pursuit. Fortunately, we all made it in time. But not only was it apparent that there was now seemingly no way of escape, but the vampires also knew where we were hiding. As we cowered together in the shelter, one of the vampire servants spoke. "You can't stay in there forever. This place belongs to our master now. When he rises tonight, he will find you
and you will die like the rest of this miserable town, alone, scared, and in agony. Part of me felt like opening the door and just getting it over with, rather than slowly rotting away in here.
Brian, however, was sure that someone would find us and said we just needed to wait it out. There was about 2 weeks' worth supply of food for 5 people in the shelter. As we sat in the shelter, terrified that the vampire's servants could break down the door at any minute, Claire broke the silence and asked, somewhat nervously, who the vampire's master was. Alan spoke, his voice quivering.
You don't want to know, and I hope, for your sake, you don't have to.
Alan revealed that there was a pistol in the shelter. It had been placed there by his father, in case they were buried alive during an air raid, and can take an easy way out. Sadly, the gun would have been no use against any of their tormentors. Guns couldn't kill vampires, and then there were only 6 bullets in the gun, but close to 50 humans under the vampire's control. Alan told us that he had contemplated using it on himself last night.
After what those monsters did to my family, I thought it would just be easy to end my pain. One quick shot to the head, then it's over. The monsters couldn't hurt me anymore. But I just couldn't bear the thought of leaving my son alone to face his horror.
He was still angry about Brian's recklessness, but also knew that if it had not been for his son's bravery, then we would all be dead now. He was proud of Brian, but after telling him so, still begged his son not to ever do anything like that again. Of course, given the type of person Brian was, he also knew his warning would not be heeded. The day was long and hard. There were so many times when I felt like opening the door and just running through them, but every time Brian and Claire would calm me down. Claire, as always, was my rock. She saved my life. But even more incredible was the fact that she was somehow managing to keep calm throughout most of this nightmare. She'd even try and steer the conversation back to normality, talking about the things that she was going to do when this nightmare was over, like marry Michael, and try and find a job teaching. That had always been her ambition, and she had always loved children. Though, to be honest, I think she liked the idea of having all those holidays off. Diana had ambitions of wanting to be a writer meanwhile, whilst I sadly didn't really know what I was going to do with my life, though again, I didn't think my future was guaranteed at that point anyway. There were moments when even Claire couldn't keep her cool, however. She cried about Marie several times. Whenever she started crying, me and Diana couldn't control ourselves either. When night finally fell, we sat there waiting for the vampire's master to show up. Alan assured us that even he couldn't get in here by force, but he was still terrified of what hideous trick the demons would try and pull on us next. Sure enough, the vampire's master, whose name I did not know at this point, soon arrived by the door with a group of his most vicious servants. They had been able to enter the garden as the house had been completely destroyed, and therefore no longer counted as a private residence. We could tell the vampires had arrived even before Karos had issued his demands by the stench that arrived with them. Karos spoke in a loud and booming voice.
Poor, pitiful creatures, clinging to life when you know it's pointless. Come out now, and I'll make sure that it's quick.
Just then I could hear the rest of the vampires burst out in fits of hysterical laughter, followed by a massive slam on the door which startled us all. Carros spoke again.
Very well, then. How about I make you a trade? One of you come out here, and I don't tear this young woman and her child to pieces.
We could hear a child and a woman screaming outside. Brian went to open the small window on the door to see for himself. Alan had warned him against it, telling him that it was a trick. But again, Brian didn't listen to his father. Brian saw a young woman, blooded, her left eye black and swollen, hugging her screaming child, who must have been no older than 3. Carros spoke again.
We'll kill them both unless you come out now. We'll make them suffer. You'll hear the sound of them screaming for mercy. I'll force the mother to watch as her child dies.
Brian headed for the door. Alan instantly jumped in front of him and pushed him back.
I cannot believe you would be stupid enough to fall for that trick. If you open that door, you will kill us all. That vermin is clearly under their control,
Alan said. But Brian, however, could not leave a young woman and her child at the mercy of the vampires, and tried to assure his father that he wasn't simply going to walk out there and expect the vampires to keep their word. He was also confident that even if she was under the vampire's control, he could handle her. Brian also still had the cross that he had used to fight off the vampires that cornered us earlier, and hoped to use it to maybe scatter the bloodsuckers around the mother and her child. Alan was still against it. Claire also offered to go instead, which Alan was still against. Obviously, he cared more for his son's well-being than any of us, but he thought it was an insane idea for anyone to go out there. Diana and I contributed nothing to the conversation, of course, as we couldn't speak German. I probably wouldn't have been brave enough to go out there at that point. In fact, I know I wouldn't. Brian couldn't be bothered to argue with his father any more, and picking up his cross, he headed out of the door as his father shouted at him. Outside, the vampires instantly swarmed Brian, but as soon as he lifted the cross, they began to cower. He quickly reached for the woman and the child. However, as he headed for the door, Carros placed his hand around the cross, and even though it visibly burnt his hand, the vampire snapped it to pieces effortlessly. The girl and the woman then fled towards the shelter, leaving Brian behind. Claire and Alan ran to the door, but there was nothing they could do. Alan did 2 empty shots into Carros, but the bloodsucker didn't even acknowledge them. Carros toyed with Brian for a while, breaking both of his arms before tossing him to the rest of the vampires, who swarmed the young man and tore him to bits. Alan screamed in anguish as he kept firing at the vampires, and it was only Claire shutting the door that prevented him from running out into them. We could hear Brian's agonised screams from inside, but fortunately they didn't last long. Brian was at least luckier than most of the victims in this respect. Meanwhile, Alan sank to his knees. He didn't even cry. He just looked completely broken. I tried to comfort Alan, whilst Diana and Claire meanwhile went over to see the woman and her child. But the child ran away and cowered in a corner. Diana tried approaching the boy again, but this time when the child turned round, Diana saw the awful truth. The child was a vampire. It had buried its head in its mother's breast before, and it had been dressed in gloves and a hat to conceal its true nature. Its mother was human, but she was completely under the vampire's control, just as Alan thought. Now Diana could see its hideous white face, massive fangs and bright red eyes, and before she could move, the monster sunk its fangs into her throat. Within seconds, it ripped her entire throat out. Claire and I ran towards Diana, but it was too late. She bled out in a matter of seconds and was dead before we could even begin to help her. Brian's heroic sacrifice had not only been for nothing, but it had cost Diana her life. The vampire child soon attacked Claire too. Despite being just a child, it still had much greater strength than either of us. Before I could try and help Claire, the mother punched me in the face. I'd never been in a fight before, and I was instantly sent crashing to the ground, my nose blooded. As I lay there on the ground, she grabbed me by the throat and began to choke the life out of me. I suddenly heard a bang, and blood splattered on my face as she fell to the floor. Alan was standing behind her, with the gun still smoking. The vampire child turned around after the shot and ran towards Alan. Alan, however, managed to knock the beast towards the floor by hitting it in the face with the gun. He then impaled the demon child right through the chest with a makeshift stake he had created from a chair leg that he'd hammered through with the butt of his gun. Upon being staked, the vampire crumbled into nothing but a tiny pile of ash on the floor. Alan then put the gun to his head and blew his brains out. There was nothing anyone could have said to talk him out of it. The vampires had destroyed his entire life. I just wish he hadn't have given the animals the satisfaction. I felt like passing out from the shock of everything that had happened, and the pain in my nose was overwhelming. A combination of the pain as well as the sight of Alan's brains splattered on the wall and Diana's blood dripping from my throat made me actually vomit. Claire helped me sit down and checked my nose to see if it was broken. She lightly pinched my nose, and when that hurt like hell, she concluded it was broken. She clearly wasn't a medical student. There were bandages in the shelter, but as she plastered up my nose, I could see a bite mark on her arm. The vampire child had managed to get a lucky bite in during the struggle. It was the final straw. I instantly started crying. Claire realised what I was upset about and put her arms around my shoulders. The vampire who bit me is dead. I'm no longer under its control. We don't know if the bite is fatal or not. Just because it's that way in the movies, it doesn't mean... I interrupted her. Barely able to speak through the tears, I told her that I couldn't imagine my life without her. Claire told me firmly that if need be, I would have to kill her. At that point, I wished Alan hadn't used that last bullet on himself. I hugged Claire as hard as I could. I swore to her that I wouldn't let anything happen to her. But it was all pointless. Over the next few hours, Claire began to weaken. Her skin turned white. Her hair fell out. Her eyes began to go red and her teeth began to enlarge. I held her in my arms. My best friend. The person I loved more than anything else in the world. As her life and everything she was slowly eaten away by a demonic force. She was brave at first, but as her condition worsened, she began to cry. She screamed that she didn't want to die. She was only 22. She wanted to marry Michael. She didn't want her parents to go through losing their only child. Her final words to me were, I can feel it. It's all going away. Everything I am. I feel like I'm already dead. Oh God, is this what they feel like all the time? They can't feel anything other than wanting to hurt people. Please don't let me live like this, Ferne. Please, kill me. Within seconds, she was gone. I hadn't even the time to grieve for Diana before Claire was taken from me too. I walked away from her corpse and headed for the stake Alan had made. But when I turned round, I saw that Claire had already risen. The sight of my friend as one of those things was the most horrifying sight I will ever see in my life. I foolishly hoped that I might be able to get through to Claire. If I had known then what I do now, I wouldn't have hesitated to stake her, but I just didn't want to admit that Claire was gone. Claire began to speak before I had a chance to say anything. Don't worry, old friend. I will make this quick, she said. I foolishly tried to reason with her. I told her to remember Michael, remember her parents, and remember that I loved her like a sister and always would. She laughed and said back to me, Don't worry, I won't change you. I couldn't spend eternity with you, constantly prattling on about your sad little issues and insecurities. It would also just be too cruel to make anyone live a life like yours forever. It's not like the vampires would accept you anyway. No one has. I cried as Claire laughed and continued to mock me. There you are, crying again, just a little girl. That's your solution to all your problems, just to cry and whimper and whine to whoever is unfortunate to be near you. I wasn't crying for the reasons she thought, however. I cried because I realised that Claire was truly gone. She would never say such a thing, even on her worst day. She loved me like a sister, and if there was one thing I was sure of, it was that. I ran to the door. Whilst I knew this monster wasn't Claire, I still didn't want to be killed by a monster that bore the face of my friend. I managed to make it out of the shelter, and to my surprise, all of the vampires were gone. I didn't stop to think why, however, as Claire was coming after me. As I ran out onto the streets, I still saw no vampires. What happened? Had they got bored of torturing me and ran away? Just then, as Claire came charging at me, an arrow suddenly shot straight into her back. It narrowly missed her heart. As she fell to the pavement, she pitifully tried to beg me for help. But again, I was not fooled. I knew the real Claire had died in that shelter. I just wish I had the courage to slay the monster bearing her face there and then. I was too scared to even look at her. And the bloodsucker, being crafty and cowardly, like all members of its kind, soon reached up, overpowered me, and used me as a human shield, stopping her attackers from firing any more arrows, before she then jumped onto a nearby roof, using her new inhuman strength, and then across several more until she was out of view. 2 men armed with crossbows then came running out of the ruins of one of the houses and cornered me. These men were from Rentros, an organisation designed to track supernatural creatures. They had managed to slay many of the attacking vampires, though sadly Karos had escaped and taken down 6 Rentros troops beforehand. The Rentros men would take me and a few survivors in. Among those who survived the slaughter included Brian's mother, Carla, who the vampires had kept alive to further torture. They wanted her to live a few days knowing what she had done to her daughter. According to one of the Rentros men, it was a favourite activity of vampires to make people murder their loved ones. He felt that vampires enjoyed dragging decent people down to their level. The Rentros men provided an official cover for the story and sent us all home. My life would be a black pit of despair for the next few years, however. Without Claire, Diana, and Marie, the loneliness was unbearable. Even to this day, I have never made friends quite so close. Eventually, however, I would overcome my depression and join Rentros. I wanted to make the vampires pay. It felt like that's all I had left. In a way, the vampires had dragged me down to their level after all. I'd spent years training with Rentros, honing my skills and body and learning everything I could about the monsters until I was able to kill them. However, as the years passed, I came to view them with pity. I saw that actually they were pathetic creatures, unable to feel anything but hatred. Slaying a vampire came as an act of mercy to me. I would also, sadly, have many more meetings with my former best friend Claire, who would soon go on to be my greatest enemy. I will kill her, one day. I know her better than anyone else. I know how her mind works, even when it's been corrupted by a demon force. I tell this story to let you know how important it is to have knowledge on what is really out there. If the me of today were trapped in Lista, my friends would still be alive. The greatest trick the devil played was in convincing you he didn't exist. And it is important that you don't fall for it like I did. There is a war going on. And while some people can get away with sticking their fingers in their ears and pretending it doesn't exist for a time, sooner or later, unless they are not vanquished, the vampire horde will catch up with us all.